October 16th, 1869. Two men digging a well behind a farm in Cardiff, New York, hit something hard at 3 feet down. Their names were Gideon Emmons and Henry Nichols. They were hired hands. They had no reason to expect anything unusual. They kept digging. What came out of the earth over the next several hours was the shape of a man, 10 feet long, stone, fully formed, a head with a face, a torso, arms, legs, toes, veins visible in the stone, eyes closed, expression peaceful, as if sleeping. The farm belonged to William Newell. Within hours, he had fenced off the excavation, hired a barker, and was charging 50 cents admission. The crowd started coming that afternoon. They came from Syracuse, they came from farms across the valley, they came on foot and by wagon, and by whatever transport they could arrange. By the end of the first week, thousands of people had paid to stand at the edge of the pit and look down at the stone figure in the ground. Nobody called it a hoax. They called it the Cardiff Giant. What happened next is usually described as the story of a successful fraud, a famous con, one of the greatest hoaxes in American history, and it was all of those things. But the more interesting question is not whether it was a fake. The more interesting question is why it worked, not just with the general public, with experts. The New York State geologist James Hall inspected the Cardiff Giant and called it the most remarkable object yet brought to light in this country. A professor from Rochester University declared it a genuine ancient statue, possibly carved by French Jesuits centuries earlier. Clergymen traveled from across the Northeast to see physical proof of the giants described in Genesis. A Syracuse-based science lecturer weighed in with his own theory about its origins. Within weeks, the ownership syndicate sold partial interest in the giant for $37,500. $37,500. In 1869, the man behind it was not William Newell. Newell was the cousin. Newell was the farmer. Newell was the man who stood at the edge of the pit, playing the part of the humble, bewildered landowner who couldn't believe what his well diggers had found. The man behind it was George Hull. Hull was a cigar maker from Binghamton, New York. He was also a committed atheist and a man with a grudge. The grudge started in 1867 in Iowa. Hull was on a business trip when he found himself at a Methodist revival meeting, arguing with a preacher named Reverend Turk about Genesis 6:4, the passage that states that there were giants who once lived on earth. Turk and his congregation believed the passage literally. Hull believed it was mythology. He made his case. He lost the argument, not because the evidence was against him, but because the crowd was against him. He left the meeting furious, and somewhere between Iowa and New York, he had an idea. If people would believe in giants on the basis of a Bible passage, what would they do if someone actually found one? Hull invested more than $2,600 over the next year and a half. He had a block of gypsum quarried near Fort Dodge, Iowa, shipped it east in secrecy, and arranged for a Chicago stonecutter to carve it into a human shape, 10 feet long. The figure was then treated with sulfuric acid to simulate centuries of weathering and beaten with metal tools to create the pore-like texture of aged skin. Here is the detail nobody mentions when they tell this story. The face carved on the Cardiff Giant was modeled after Hull's own face. The man who built a fake giant to prove that people were gullible about giants put his own face on the giant. Whether that was vanity, or a private joke, or something else, Hull never explained. The finished figure was shipped to Newell's farm in an iron-sealed box, buried at night near the barn, and left there for almost a full year before Newell hired the well diggers. A full year underground, because Hull understood something important about how belief works. A fake found immediately after carving looks like a prank. A fake pulled from the earth after months in the ground carries the theater of discovery. Dirt is persuasive. Watching workers uncover something body-shaped from the soil triggers something older than skepticism. The target was not professional archaeology. The target was public appetite, and it worked. What Hull did not plan for was P.T. Barnum. By late 1869, the Cardiff Giant was on a tour of New York State. It had stopped in Syracuse. Crowds were still coming. The ownership syndicate, led by a businessman named David Hannum, was doing well. Phineas Taylor Barnum arrived and offered $50,000 to purchase the giant. Hannum refused. Barnum went home and had his own Cardiff giant made. He displayed it at his museum in New York City and told audiences it was the original. When Hannum's version arrived in New York on tour and set up nearby, both giants were drawing crowds simultaneously, the original fake and the copy of the fake. Barnum's version drew larger crowds. Hannum, watching audiences pay to see the imitation of his imitation, was heard to say, "There's a sucker born every minute." That phrase has been attributed to Barnum ever since. It was not Barnum who said it. It was the man who owned the original fake, complaining about the audiences paying to see the replica. Hannum sued Barnum for fraud. The case went before a judge. The judge ruled that Barnum could not be charged with misrepresenting his giant as authentic because the original giant was not authentic either. You cannot commit fraud about a fraud. Hull had not planned for any of this. By the end of 1869, there were competing Cardiff giants being exhibited across the Northeast. The Philadelphia Inquirer called the situation rich, that we should be victimized by a fraud upon a fraud. Hull had built one fake. The market had built more. On December 10, 1869, less than 2 months after the giant came out of the ground, Hull walked into a newspaper office and confessed. He was not apologetic. He was proud. He explained exactly what he had done and exactly why he had done it, and he said that he wanted to demonstrate how easily the Christian community could be fooled by something that confirmed what they already wanted to believe. The sculptor who had carved the figure confirmed Hull's account. The gypsum quarry in Iowa confirmed where the block had come from. Everything Hull said checked out. Yale paleontologist Othniel Charles Marsh had already declared the giant a most decided humbug, noting that fresh tool marks visible in the gypsum would not have survived centuries underground, and that soluble gypsum buried in wet New York soil would have deteriorated long before any modern discovery. Marsh was right from the beginning, but Marsh's assessment, published in the newspapers, had not stopped the crowds. It had not slowed ticket sales. It had not prevented serious men from declaring the Cardiff giant the most remarkable object ever found in America. The giant was fake, and everyone who mattered said so, and people kept paying to see it anyway. Here is what the Cardiff giant story is usually understood to mean. It is understood as evidence that people are credulous, that in an era before modern scientific methods, before standardized archaeological practice, before any formal framework for evaluating claims like this, educated people could be fooled by a well-executed fake. That is accurate. But that interpretation misses the more interesting question underneath it. Why did the fake travel so well? The answer is that Hull had not created an idea from nothing. He had plugged into something that was already there. By 1869, American newspapers had been publishing stories about petrified men for more than a decade, not fictional stories, stories that were presented as genuine discoveries, discoveries of human beings turned to stone, found in various conditions and locations across the country. A pamphlet printed in Philadelphia in the 1850s had collected the most sensational cases. Petrified men had become a cultural phenomenon before Hull built his version. And older than any of that, the Onondaga people, whose territory included the valley where the Cardiff giant was found, had their own tradition of the stone giants, enormous beings who had once walked the land. When an Onondaga man examined the Cardiff figure closely, he concluded it was not from his people's tradition. He said, "Not ours, not ours," meaning the memory of stone giants existed. It was just not this one. Hull had built a fake to disprove the existence of giants. And in doing so, he had demonstrated that the appetite for giants was so deeply embedded in American culture, in its religious texts, its folklore, its newspapers, its oral traditions, that a 10-foot gypsum figure buried for a year in a New York farm field was, on first contact, immediately believed. He had set out to prove that people were gullible about giants. He had instead proved that something about giants, specifically, reached into a part of human belief that ordinary skepticism could not easily reach. Marsh's debunking was correct. The giant was fake. Hull confessed. The legal case confirmed it. But here is what happened after the confession. Crowds kept coming, not because they thought it was real, because now they knew it wasn't real, and they wanted to see it anyway. To stand at the edge of the pit and look at the stone figure and feel whatever it was they had felt before they knew it was gypsum, before they knew a cigar maker with a grudge had put his own face on it, before the Yale paleontologist had identified the chisel marks. That feeling did not require the giant to be ancient. That feeling was older than the giant. The Cardiff giant is still on display at the Farmers Museum in Cooperstown, New York. It has been there for decades. You can see it today. You can stand at the edge and look down at the 10-foot figure, the eyes closed, the expression peaceful, the face, if you know what Hull looked like, unmistakably his. A man built a fake giant to prove that people are foolish enough to believe in giants. He put his own face on it. He buried it for a year and then staged its discovery. He sold it for $37,000 and watched serious men declare it the greatest object ever found in America. He confessed 2 months later. He was proud of himself, and people kept coming. Mark Twain wrote a story about it in 1870. L. Frank Baum, who would later write The Wizard of Oz, wrote a poem about it. Both of them understood that the Cardiff giant was not really about a fake. It was about what the fake had found, not in the ground, in us.